Welcome to the Sheth Leadership Academy Lecture Series, a series of lectures delivered by Professor Jagdish Sheth, author of Chindia Rising, The Rule of Three, and over 20 other business books. This lecture is part one of how industries are born, grow, and revitalize, efficiency versus growth. I hope you enjoy this interesting and important topic.
This particular lecture is more about industries and less about companies. There are really very few theories about how industries come up, how industries are born, how do they grow, why do they plateau, and how are they revitalized. While we do have the traditional product life cycle theory comparable to the industry life cycle theory or the inevitability of birth, growth, and death, I don't think it's sufficient. There are some theories out there about how industries come through competition, such as, for example, Joseph Schumpeter's idea of constructive destruction. We have things about disruptive technologies and how outsiders destroy an industry and a new industry is born. But most of them are really not very well articulated or very well validated theories. So in this lecture, I would like to give much more broader perspective about the rise of an industry, the growth of an industry, and very likely the revitalization of an industry. In other words, the industries may not die, but they get reborn, they get repositioned, they get, in fact, pretty much reincarnated. So let's start this lecture. The title is How Industries Are Born, Grow, and Revitalize, and the typical dilemma of efficiency versus growth. Industries are always driven by two factors, efficiency versus growth, and we'll look upon that as a framework with which to understand how industries are born, how industries grow, and how industries revitalize. Contrary to popular belief, industries are born due to many factors besides new breakthroughs and inventions. In fact, larger percentage of new industries come from existing knowledge rather than breakthrough knowledge. Quick example I can give you is Uber or sharing economy. So you have Uber, Airbnb. Those are the kinds of industries where technology is already in place. It is somebody put it together, essentially. You can also think about childcare industry, multi-billion-dollar new industry. There is nothing new about any breakthrough concepts, but definitely no inventions. And I can go on giving examples. Most of the industries are essentially successful due to exceptional marketing and execution or operations. We give too much credit to innovation and entrepreneurship and not enough credit to marketing or execution unless we believe marketing itself is entrepreneurial and execution is an entrepreneurial, but that means stretching the point. As I mentioned earlier, industry is not created by what the economist Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction. As you know, Schumpeter quite believed in Karl Marx theory, namely that capitalism, by creating wealth and concentrating wealth, will destroy itself. That there will be a revolt by the working class against the wealthy class, and that revolution will bring about a change. While Schumpeter agreed with that concept, he believed that capitalism, rather than destroying itself, will mutate itself through what he called creative destruction. However, many industries are actually created by government policy. Governments create an industry by a stroke of pen. Governments destroy industries by a stroke of pen. We know the power of the pen in creating industries as much as power of capitalism. Other examples would be the new education programs. Examples will be the new healthcare areas. Examples will be defense industry, which in most countries is not privatized as it is in America. So we have lots of examples. Cell phone industry was created by government policy. Mandatory seat belts creating a demand was mandatory policy. Governments have created monopolies and even defined economics as natural monopoly, which means one company is more efficient than more companies, no competition. This is how we organize the electric utility industry and the telephone industry, the old wireline, landline, copper wire telephone industry. So my own view is that surprisingly, it is not creative destruction as much as what I would call creative duplication, which means if somebody comes out with an idea, everybody wants to jump into that one and copy that idea or duplicate that idea, and in the process the industry gets a lift. Examples are, again, for example, now that we have the Uber concept, everybody is duplicating Uber concept both in ride sharing such as Lyft and others, or in Airbnb, and there will be clones of Airbnb about getting excess capacity of homes and rooms to be shared or to be rented out. The rental economy is a new paradigm, and everybody is jumping into that one. You can rent the gowns, for example, you can rent the cars, you can rent the rooms, you can rent the houses, you can rent the palaces, just goes on. Cell phone industry grew the same way by having government allow competition at the manufacturing level, whereby cell phone manufacturers will come in hordes and lift the industry. So industry is really created not as much by the traditional thinking about diffusion of innovation, where somebody is an influencer, gatekeeper, who says, I will adopt the technology first and then influences the masses, as Everett Rogers talked about. So you have the innovator, the opinion makers, and the masses. That also is not the case. I find industry is created more by the supply side, not by the demand side. If you don't believe that, think about 100 years ago when they started the automobile industry in America. Before Model T and assembly line principle came in, actually we had more than 500 automobile makers. In the agricultural equipment market in the early days of modernization of agriculture, same thing, about 225 people were making tractors, trailers, whatever they are in agriculture they used. So it is really creative duplication. So let's look at how new industries are born. I did extensive research, and my job always is to synthesize this, classify them, categorize them. So here are 10 ways new industries are born, and most of them have nothing to do with breakthrough innovations or even entrepreneurship in the traditional way we think about. The first and the most common way industries have grown is to things that are manual, make it more and more automated. The whole industrial revolution began when the manual way of creating textiles was too long a cycle, less production capacity, more demand, homegrown cottage industries. How do you scale it up into a modern factory? And that led to creating, let's say, power-based looms, power-based, in fact, machineries for textile industry. Then we had, of course, added chemicals to make the textile much more, malleable, I guess, much more wearable, manufacturable, whatever word you would like. So manual to automation. By the way, industrial revolution basically automated the factories, which are all labor intensive, no capital whatsoever. And what happened through the industrial revolution has already happened through the digital revolution, where all of the secretaries and the steno pools, and those have all gone now through word processors. I remember the days when we used to have a mimeograph way of making college exams. Stenographers, we used to have shorthand stenographers, they're all gone. And now white collar professionals, highest paid wage earners are getting automated, whether you are a lawyer or you are a doctor and even a professor for that matter. So manual to automation has been the biggest way of creating new industries, which leads to the second way, which says outsourcing is a very key area for growth of a new industry. When people do it in the organization or at home, it is never counted in the GDP calculations or in national accounts as it is called. But when I outsource, let's say, my IT services, my legal services, my accounting services, then those become standalone industries. So what are internally cost centers become basically revenue producing industries. So you see the Indian IT services, almost $150 to $2 billion industry. IBM basically services side growing enormously. All of those are really corporate outsourcing of certain key functions, which really began to happen after, I would say, the first energy crisis. Once we began to question that vertical integration and doing everything in-house was a good model. When we give up that theory during the restructuring and the re-engineering the corporation, we began to see the growth of the outsourcing industry. Today, of course, the biggest outsourcing comes home. The next generation of young people really do not know how to cook, clean, or take care of childcare. And because of that, we have eating out phenomenon, the restaurant phenomenon. We have the home maid services phenomenon. And the same way, in fact, we have a childcare industry growing into multi-billion-dollar industries as new industries altogether. The third, and again very common, is really reducing the friction in commerce and in consumption. Primarily, it has to do with accessibility problem. There is a supplier and there is a consumer or a buyer. And there is a friction in terms of the two getting together, whether it's a credit friction, financial friction, payment friction, shipping, logistic friction, whatever it is. And today, as you know, reducing friction in commerce, matching suppliers and the buyers is a very key platform in the online digital environment, or what you call e-commerce. All these great e-commerce companies have come by simply identifying a friction in terms of accessing the product or the service and its fulfillment in some fashion or its consumption, and they've grown enormously from the Amazons of the world to everything online, essentially, to the airlines today, etc. So reducing friction is a third major platform. Fourth one is a more traditional understanding, tap into unmet needs. And one of the key reasons why a need is unmet is because the consumer cannot afford it. The need is unmet in an enterprise or in a government bureau or in a university is because there is a budget. Today, the whole nations are struggling with the budget concept. As you know, we have an enormous fiscal problems where the revenues are not coming and the expenses are still there. So the American economy, through public budgets, is restructuring. Eurozone is restructuring. Examples of Greece, for example, or Ireland, which has turned around, all the things you can clearly see. So most of that unmet need is due to affordability. And we learn how to make products, how to market products in a more affordable way and creating brand new industries. I mean, this has happened with watches. I think America has been the pioneer in the concept of making things affordable, not just through competition, but also through innovation. We made automobiles affordable by creating assembly line principle, Model T, Henry Ford. We made watches very affordable. Unlike Swiss watchmakers, we came out with watchmaking primarily. In fact, what is called the machine watches. Timex was a big disruptive watchmaker in the process. And today we see now the Japanese quartz technology. And of course, the latest one is the watch by Apple, watch by Samsung, Fitbit, and those guys have come in to create brand new industries in the watch industry. Industries don't die, they get revitalized, they get reborn, is the message here. Next one is much more interesting. How do you make want into a need? I call converting wants into needs. I can't even imagine how we cannot live without a cell phone when we lived without a cell phone all our lives. Today you cannot live without a refrigerator, and we lived without a refrigerator all our life. Today we have a dishwasher. I mean, I can go on and on examples. Automobiles are becoming what would be a want and a status symbol into a daily necessity. So my view is that when wants become needs, new industries start. From cell phones to the Wi-Fi to the broadband internet access, anything you can think about. Next platform is much more interesting for creating new industries or emergence of new industries, which is unbranded markets or products made into branded markets or products. This is the opportunity in emerging markets, especially where you still have the traditional bazaars, where you see commodities like rice, lentils, wheat, everything offered in open sacks. There is no branding. There is a possibility of adulteration. So branding, quality assurance, proper measures, count or weight or liter, whatever it is, all of those create enormous value. You may not need any new technology even. It's a question of can you just do it, execution, and can you market it? So today in countries like India, for example, snacks, which is very common, popular thing Indians eat, all street vendors will offer what's called the street foods, are all becoming packaged branded foods, and companies are growing enormously. Industries are all growing enormously in the process. So unbranded products and services, how do you brand them and create new industries? In advanced countries, it is no longer products, which we have mostly branded it, but services are about to be branded. For example, haircut. We used to have this mom and pop haircut stylist, especially women's hair salons are still mom and pop. There are thousands of them, but there is no national brand of a hair salon. There is no national brand of a hair cutting place. We do see the emergence of some of them, but it is still not there. It's an unorganized, unbranded sector in the services area, and how do we brand and organize would be a key thing. As we have done with the banks, as we have done with cell phone operators, service providers, as we have done with some of the maybe more professional categories. Universities we have branded obviously very well, but my view is that, for example, the law firms still have not branded very well. Accounting firms may not have branded themselves very well. So branding opportunities are much more creating new industries altogether when there's a large market served by unbranded services as they were by unbranded products. Next one is much more obvious. That is, once a platform is created by public investments such as bridges, highways, old age waterways, railways, today the internet. What happens is that those infrastructure investments, banking, credit bureaus, etc., when you create that, industries spawn around them. And leveraging those infrastructures, which is free, but using that and creating a market out of them is a very key area. In fact, if you look at the history of the old bazaars or trading posts in America, they all began around some sort of a infrastructure, riverbed. There was a river place, or there was a port somehow. It has a natural location advantage, and that is where you began to do commerce. That idea in a modern way would be, how do I create commerce on the internet? How do you create commerce on the smartphone platforms by and large? And that's what we see as an enormous growth. Number 8, government policy. As I made a point earlier, markets are created not just by competition, but markets or industries are created by government stroke of pen. And we have lots of examples, as I mentioned earlier, about seat belts to airbags to, things in the airplane, everything that is safety-based regulation, or demarketing, destroying industries like cigarette industry from not allowing to smoke, etc. So government policy can organize, regulate, and create the industries. Next area, which is more fascinating. I have discovered that more recently in my research, in my consulting, etc., namely, anything you invent here, market may be someplace else. So when you review all these business plans of new startup companies, you find fascinating that they never thought about inventing here and marketing there. So we find many of the emerging economy technologies based on mobile platforms like M-Pesa in Kenya, where 20% of the GDP is all done on cell phones, can be easily done in advanced countries. And advanced countries may be willing to pay a lot more. Things you invent in advanced country, you may not be able to market very well because there are gatekeepers, entrenched competition, but competition just may not be there in an emerging economy. So if you want to make text messaging, this country was not into text messaging. When we started the cellular phone, we were so voice-centric. But in the rest of the world, text became a very common phenomenon. So you invented technology of giving alerts through text messages and market it there. A company out of Atlanta called Air2Web learned this, invented here, and they figured out there is no market as yet ready for that. And they went to India, and they probably end up doing more than 100 million text messages for airlines or for banks, whatever the customers are out there or their clients are. And the last one, which is very interesting area, one that we all know, it's just eureka. Somebody was fooling around in the laboratory and came out with some solution that he or she never thought. In other words, it's just accidental success. We have lots and lots of those examples. The most popular and the most famous example in contemporary times would be probably Post-it notes at 3M company. The inventor was trying to do something else, and he found he has come out with a glue that can stick and unstick. Most glue sticks but doesn't unstick. They never thought there was any market for this thing. And suddenly they found a huge new market, and has created a whole new industry in the process. So here are the 10 ways we can grow new industries, which is much broader perspective than what earlier economists have talked about or what we have been taught in classes. So as you can be seen, new industries are born much more by exceptional marketing and by exceptional execution operations as by innovation and entrepreneurship. FedEx as a company and the industry, next day delivery. UPS as a company and industry, rapid packaging delivery. All grew as a standalone industries because of exceptional execution as well as in fact exceptional marketing. This is my view, that I think we need to give as much credit to marketing and operations as we do to innovation and entrepreneurship. This is about how industries are born. Now let me talk about how industries get organized. Industries have a very predictable way of getting organized, and somehow from mom and pop, industries go through a cycle of shakeouts. Things are not standardized, they get standardized. In the beginning, an industry, because it is a constructive duplication as I call it, too many people jump into it, too much capacity is created, there's always an excess capacity that needs to be rationalized. So the industries get organized not as much by any organizational theory, centralization, decentralization, whatever we teach, but it is strictly by access to capital or lack of access to capital. In other words, startup companies run out of money. This was true of the automobile guys in the early 1900s, the equipment makers in the agriculture sector. This is true universally from time immemorial. And therefore, access to capital and the people who have the capital are really the market makers, and they organize the industry. Such as, for example, J.P. Morgan was a famous banker who literally created the steel industry, literally created the automobile industry or the oil industry. Today we have venture capitalists, especially in California, in Silicon Valley. They are very famous. They create the market. They organize the market. Often they will end up investing into multiple companies in the same space. Often they will end up encouraging merger acquisitions and roll up. Private equity is a very big area, starting with Warren Buffett, for example, buying out traditional corporations whose public equity had collapsed and their cost of capital had risen through junk bonds to a level that was not sustainable, and restructuring them. As we have done sort of the non-benign private equity people like KKR, etc., who take hostile takeover, or today what we call investor activists like Carl Icahn, etc. So private equity really makes the difference in organizing an industry. So we have today Blackstone, Temasek in Singapore, sovereign fund people, China Investment Corporation is a very big one now rising, as we have the Berkshire Hathaway. Access to capital is therefore a real competitive advantage of entrepreneurs. Customers are given. That's a hygiene factor. If you're not customer centric, you can never get off the ground. So the old notion of the purpose of a business is to create and retain customer today is basically, the chips and the steaks at the table kind of a notion, or what we call in the academic world the hygiene factor. It's given. And therefore, companies that have done very, very well as entrepreneurial and created brand new industries always learned access to capital, whether you were the Rockefellers, for example. And in fact, I can even go back and say that Columbus, the great discoverer, the explorer who discovered America, trying to figure out how to reach India for spices, was able to raise the capital. So even those explorers had to have capital. And the kings or somebody bet on their capital either for their selfish reasons, capitalistic reasons, or for their some sort of a evangelical reasons, or whatever the reasons are. But ultimately, access to capital is the real competitive advantage in organizing an industry. Shakeouts and mergers occur, again, more due to capital shortage rather than differentiation and competition. I know that I've been always taught that shakeouts and mergers arise because I can differentiate better than the existing person, and therefore I have more the customer loyalty, customer shifting the loyalty, etc. More and more I have done research and advising, more I find the shakeouts and mergers happen because people have run out of capital, which usually happens because an industry in the heat of duplication creates excess capacity, as I mentioned before. And therefore, consistently I have found that there is a first mover disadvantage. We have always been talking about the first mover advantage. I find the opposite. Pioneers of an industry die. It is the second round of organizers who make money. So if you talk about the video games, for example, companies such as Atari, Intellivision, Sega, etc. were created, but they died. And then we had the next generation of Japanese companies like Sony with PlayStation 2. Now we have the Microsoft with Xbox, etc. You see, evolution industry gets organized around due to shakeout mergers, which arise primarily due to oxygen is gone. There is no oxygen in the air, and therefore people are just simply can't breathe anymore, which is capital or the cash. Next area is the de jure, which means by law, as well as de facto are standards which are equally important in industry organizations. I've been very fascinated about how standards creates a whole new industry, whether standards are set by the government, which is de jure, or they arise de facto standards, such as Google standard on Android, such as, for example, Google standard on search engines, such as, for example, Microsoft in Exchange, Microsoft Windows, they become de facto standards, and then of course they try to protect by intellectual property rights or by somehow people not being able to know how it is done. Coca-Cola, secret recipe, de facto standard, how to make soft drinks. That's the example. So today Microsoft, Apple, etc. are creating, and the de jure standard, I can give you the best example. We invented the cellular telephone in America. We commercialized it, and we lost it because we allowed the capitalistic approach to creating a standard, but we never got a standard established, a de facto standard. We had the AMP standard, then we had, of course, the CDMA, the TDMA, the GSM, whereas the European Union decided there'll be one pan-European standard called GSM, and today rest is history. The de jure standard became the de facto standard through government blessing, and today the largest number of subscribers are on GSM platform. I also wanted to say that the great historian Alfred Chandler, who really began to study business history, and came out with the logic that a certain strategy has to be aligned with the structure. The structure has to create to fit the strategy. And he came out with the idea that to create conglomerates, the best strategy is to make conglomerate a holding company, a centralized one, but highly decentralized business units or operations. He studied, for example, companies like Sears and General Motors, who were the icons in their days, and tried to prove a point that the role of the organization at a centralized level is access to the capital, and you must decentralize and allocate the capital, create a portfolio of products, portfolio of companies, and that's a strategy that he recommended. My view is that, and of course his main argument was that structure must follow strategy. What I find, unfortunately, is that strategy today is no longer long term. Strategy today is more volatile than budgeting. Every quarter the CEO is struggling and sort of, trying to figure out what to do. Strategy is no longer in American football one long play. It is scramble, scramble, scramble. Given that situation, if a strategy is constantly dynamic and evolving, can you restructure all the time? It's impossible. So one cannot reorganize all the time. Unfortunately, because of that, now you see the company, now you don't see the company. Company is out of business. Company is bought out. There are mergers, acquisitions. 2015 would be a record year of mergers, acquisitions in the US, and if European economy was doing well, would be equally large. So mergers, acquisitions happen. And by the way, I found in my research on why good companies fail, I was absolutely shocked to find out that the average life expectancy of all great companies has been steadily declining. So today, if you take the Fortune 500 companies or S&P 500 companies, the average life cycle of these large companies is only, I think in England it's only 4.5 years, America maybe 6-7 years, Germany is about 7 years, France maybe a little longer, which is mind-boggling. So the sheer survival of the corporation itself now is in jeopardy, let alone its strategy and its structure. So the strategy structure theories we taught may have been right for the time, but they are just not becoming relevant today. For example, Sears. Sears is gone. Great conglomerate retailer Sears created by not only offering products, but buying, building homes, for example, financing, for example, repair, maintenance, all of the stuff. Today Sears is struggling to survive. In fact, my view is that it is a patient on the ventilator, essentially. It's in the last stages, propped up by private equity people. So is General Motors. People question whether General Motors can even survive, where you had a centralized corporation and decentralized brand name divisions like the Chevrolet, Pontiac, Buick, Oldsmobile, Cadillac. Or does it have to rethink at all? Are we in the automobile business or some other business altogether? Point number 7. Unfortunately, there is one more factor that we have not taken into account, which is like Great Depression, the industry restructuring after the first energy crisis of 74 to 78, and of course the Great Recession that we went through in 2007 and 8. In all those 3 times, what happens is that the stock market is out of favor. People want to put their money in their hand, under mattress, in cash positions, and when the public equity market collapses, it has a double damage, because on that equity they have done borrowing, 1-to-1 ratio. But if my public equity becomes 50 cents, the ratio is now 1-to-2. And if you are more aggressive borrower, long-term debt, you struggle more, which is what happened in the 80s. All the conglomerates, the value of the company was less than the parts. The sum of parts was less than each of the individual parts. And you see the same thing happening after 2007-8 recession. The breakup value is much greater of corporations as the stock market is not doing as well more recently. So we see Dow and DuPont merging, but then deciding to break it up into 2-3 businesses. Kraft Foods has gone through by spinning out Mondelez and keeping Kraft as 2 separate companies. We see more spin-offs and divestments in pharmaceutical industry, and my view is that this is a new phenomenon where the breakup value of a corporation is greater than the corporation itself. And to me, that phenomenon is going to continue throughout the rest of the decade, and therefore another set of propositions we have to come out of how the industry gets organized. So here is a framework which I found consistently true across hundreds of industries I've analyzed at a product level, if not at a company level. All industries are constantly trying to achieve 2 objectives: efficiency, that comes through productivity, that comes through automation, that comes through lowering the wages cost, however you do it, and growth. So when an industry starts as a startup industry, if you take the life cycle perspective, it is struggling for growth. Struggling for efficiency. Growth is spectacular, but how do I organize it? How do I execute it? That's the key thing. Whether it's the new rental economy, sharing economy, whether it's the new iPhones, cell phones, whatever it is, they're growing spectacularly. So growth is given when the industry is born, but what it does not have is the efficiency or productivity. And therefore the emphasis shifts toward efficiency as the primary driver in the early stage of the industry evolution. So upper left, startup industry, scale is the challenge, and whoever does a good job becomes the winner, as we have seen in the early stages of automatic washing machines, refrigerators, automobiles, watches, all the things we talked about. We'll talk about how do you achieve the scale a little later on. Second one is growth. Industry is growing very well. It is very productive, producing enormous cash flow. So cash inflow now becomes cash outflow also. It's reinvesting back into the industry and the company, but you need to diversify. It needs to expand beyond just selling the same product and doing more and more penetration. So the second phase is how do I diversify into new markets and into new product lines. Now the industry matures. At the stage of maturity, they have already done the diversification. They have got the scale and the productivity. You cannot squeeze any more productivity out of the industry. So now the industry is struggling for revitalization. So we'll talk about how industries get revitalized. And the last one is that when the industry is unable to revitalize, it really begins to gradually slow down, and an industry which is a sort of a core becomes a peripheral industry, becomes a niche player, becomes from a full line general market to specialty market. We have seen this thing in supermarkets, for example. We have seen these things into the iridium, for example, in these sort of a radio-based cellular telephones. satellite-based telephones, etc. So what is peripheral becomes core, what is core becomes peripheral, which is a very powerful theory, and therefore industry survives being more like a niche player. Right now we are watching that that's going to happen with, for example, the company that created the database security system, which is struggling to survive, okay? Nokia. We cannot do that. They created a good job from voice to data, but they have not gotten into the other thing. So it's becoming a niche player primarily for the enterprise market. So this cycle, now I will talk about how the efficiency comes through scale. Again, it is just more than what we talk about in the academic world or in consulting world. It is not just through shakeouts and mergers, which is the typical expectation because we are so competition centric about industries. My view is that the biggest way industry gets organized is through public policy. And there are two areas I've identified as key public policy platforms. One is, as I mentioned earlier, through strictly government mandate, which means it makes demand mandatory consumption, and market is created. So there is no marketing challenge. It's all about supply function. Safety rules, environmental policies, mandatory use, as I mentioned, legalized consumption, like we are going through with marijuana right now, for example. It's creating a brand new industry by fiat, by public policy, by regulation. The governments can also create, as I mentioned, regulated monopolies. We have municipality services, which are regulated monopolies, public highways, public health, Medicare platform, especially Medicaid platform, and all the welfare programs are really markets created by regulated monopolies, or they have given regulated monopolies, as we used to have with the airlines before deregulation, as we had it with the wireline telephone companies, as I mentioned, as we still have it with electric utility companies. The third one is a scale by de facto standards, where you are sharing a standard and sharing the cost of creating a standard. The industry association can be a pioneer in this area. Most of the digital electronics is basically created by sharing the standards through licensing intellectual property. So Android becomes de facto standard. Windows become de facto standard because both of these companies license others to use it and expand the market or serve the market. Contract manufacturing, same thing. You are basically sharing the cost or sharing the standard, however it is. So we have a very large contract manufacturing or third-party manufacturing. Now we have a very large third-party warehousing, for example. So as I mentioned, outsourcing is a very key platform, and in that case often you have shared costs or shared standards. And the last one is the traditional one, shakeouts and mergers. So when I analyze the 100-year history of the automobile industry in America, from this 500 or more automobile makers, everybody making one car in a garage, one at a time, like we build homes, it began to have the assembly line principle. Model T came, created a de facto standard, and rest is history. Shakeouts and mergers took place, and in the process we created three large corporations, the Ford Motor Company, General Motors, and Chrysler, who are the survivors. We see this happening in pharma industry right now, and with the new Affordable Care Act, or what is known as Obamacare, we see the whole healthcare insurance industry restructuring itself. Shakeouts and mergers are taking place. Banks have gone through that after 2007-2008 economic recession, and as I mentioned, automobile industry through the normal process. Second area is how do we grow the industry? And there are two mechanisms. One mechanism is to grow the industry where you have got a customer, you dominate the customer, you gain market share. So market share has been the key strategy for growth, and we have linked market share as a key indicator of how efficient the industry is, and out of which you see the rule of three prevailing. Three large companies dominate the market, etc., that I will talk about a little later on. But main strategy now goes from fighting for a market share of a product around which an industry is organized to adding more products, or what is called from market share to share of wallet, one-stop shop. How do you do that thing? By adding more product lines, either as a manufacturer or as a distributor or as a retailer, however you do it. Or one can grow by going abroad. So from existing market, which is domestic generally, how do you go internationally, which is a global expansion. And the last one is repositioning the industry altogether from where it is to where it needs to go, such as I can easily say I'm no longer a carbonated beverage soft drinks maker, I'm a carbonated carbonated beverage. I'm a beverage company, for example, non-alcoholic beverages. And things like that one can reposition. I'm not just an airline, but I'm in a transport business. This is the famous saying that Ted Levitt, Harvard Business School professor in marketing, who always talked about marketing myopia. In other words, are you in a railroad business or are you in transportation business? That begins to reposition the company altogether. And that is the strategy, or the whole industry for that matter, because the industry does not survive on its traditional technology or its platform.
Thanks for listening to part 1 of How Industries Are Born, Grow, and Revitalize: Efficiency versus Growth with Professor Jagdish Sheth. For more about Professor Sheth and the Sheth Leadership Academy, visit www.shethleadershipacademy.com.